The letter was already in Violet Townsend's hand when Ralph Rhodes walked through the door of the Silver Creek post office, and the look on his face when he saw it, that particular shade of gray that washes over a proud man when he realizes he has been both saved and humiliated in the same breath, was something Violet would remember for the rest of her life. She had not meant for him to find out this way. She had not meant for him to find out at all. The small post office sat at the center of Redemption, New Mexico territory, in the year 1882, and the afternoon sun drove through its single westward window like a blade, cutting Ralph's silhouette into something sharp and dangerous as he stepped across the threshold. He was a tall man, broad across the shoulders in the way that years of cattle ranching will make a man broad, with dark hair going silver at the temples and eyes so deeply brown they looked almost black when he was angry. And he was angry now. He held his hat in his hand, knuckles white around the brim, and he was staring at the envelope she held as if it were a piece of evidence against him in a trial he had not known was happening. "Where did you get that?" he said. It was not quite a question. His voice was low, controlled, the kind of controlled that is actually the outer edge of something much less controlled. Violet lifted her chin. She was 26 years old, and she had spent the last 4 of those years running her father's household. And she had learned a very long time ago that the only way to face a man like Ralph Rhodes was to stand very still and let him come to the edge of himself without flinching. "Your daughter brought it to me," she said. The silence that followed was so heavy it had texture. "My daughter," Ralph said. "Clara," Violet confirmed. "She came to me 3 days ago. She said you had been trying to write it yourself for 2 months and that you kept burning every draft in the fireplace. She asked me to help." Something moved across Ralph's face that she could not name. It was not anger, or not only anger. It was something deeper and more hidden, something that looked almost like grief being forced underground by sheer force of will. "You had no right," he said. "No," Violet agreed quietly. "I did not, but Clara did. She is 12 years old and she has been watching her father suffer in silence for 2 months because he is too proud to ask for help, and she loves you, Mr. Rhodes, so she asked someone else to do what you would not let yourself do." His jaw tightened. He crossed the room in 3 long strides and reached for the letter, and Violet, to her own considerable surprise, did not give it to him. "It is addressed," she said. "It is ready to post. Let me send it." "Give it to me, Miss Townsend." "Let me send it, Mr. Rhodes." They stood there in the golden, dusty light, close enough that she could see the exact moment the fight went out of him. It happened somewhere behind his eyes, a withdrawal, a surrender of a particular kind that is not defeat but is something more complicated and more painful. He stepped back. He put his hat on. He walked out without another word, and Violet stood there holding the letter, her heart hammering against her ribs with an urgency she did not entirely understand. And then she turned to the counter and slid the envelope across to old Hector Price, who had the grace to pretend he had heard none of it. "Post it," she said, "please." That was how the story truly began, though to understand what the letter was and what it meant, and why a man like Ralph Rhodes could not bring himself to write it without his daughter's intervention, you have to go back much further than that afternoon in the post office. You have to go back nearly a year, to the autumn of 1881, when a fire changed everything. Redemption, New Mexico territory, was not a large town in 1881. It had been established 15 years earlier along a dry creek bed that turned out, after all, to produce a modest flow of water during the wet season, and it had grown the way frontier towns grew, organically, desperately, with a kind of stubborn faith that characterized everyone who came west looking for something they had not been able to find anywhere else. There was a general store run by a man named Holt Becker, who was honest and fair and moderately prosperous. There was a saloon called the Desert Rose, which was neither a desert nor a rose, but was always warm and reasonably stocked. There was a schoolhouse, a livery stable, a blacksmith, a church that had been built before anyone decided what denomination it would serve, a doctor's office, and the post office run by old Hector Price, who had ridden for the Pony Express in his youth and considered himself therefore a man of consequence and letters. And on the eastern edge of town, just where the flat scrubland began to ripple upward into the red hills that eventually became actual mountains, there was the Townsend house, a solid adobe structure with a wide porch and a kitchen garden, and a very old woman named Dolores who had worked for Violet's father, Edmund Townsend, since before Violet was born. Edmund Townsend had come to New Mexico Territory from Virginia in 1860, bringing with him a young wife, a modest inheritance, a crate of books, and a conviction that the land in the West would make a man's fortune if he was patient enough. He had been partially right. He had built a successful freight business that carried goods between Redemption and the larger supply town of Las Cruces to the south, and he had been modestly prosperous for most of Violet's childhood. His wife, Catherine, had died of fever when Violet was 8, and Edmund had never remarried. He raised Violet himself, with Dolores' considerable help, and he taught her to read and to do accounts and to ride a horse, and he loved her in the particular fierce and inarticulate way that lonely men love the children who are their only remaining connection to something tender. The freight business had been doing well enough in the spring of 1881. Edmund was 63 years old by then, not as sharp as he had once been, and Violet had quietly taken over most of the administrative work, keeping the ledgers, writing the contracts, corresponding with suppliers in Las Cruces and El Paso. It was she who noticed, in late July of 1881, that a series of payments from their primary contractor had not arrived. It was she who wrote the letters of inquiry, and it was she who ultimately discovered that their primary contractor had been quietly directing his business to a rival freighting outfit out of Santa Fe. They were not ruined, but they were damaged. And then, in early October of 1881, one of their freight wagons, their best one, the one that could carry the heaviest loads, was destroyed in a fire. The fire started in the livery stable where the wagon was stored overnight, and it spread to 2 adjacent buildings before the town got it under control. The cause was never officially determined, though there was some speculation about a lantern left burning, and some darker speculation about deliberate arson, but neither theory was ever proven. The loss of the wagon pushed the Townsend freight business from damaged to genuinely precarious. Edmund, already diminished by age and grief, and the accumulated weight of a long life lived in difficult country, seemed to fold inward after that fire. He still came to dinner. He still sat on the porch in the evenings, but the light in him was lower than it had been, and Violet watched it with a particular species of fear that she was careful never to show. It was in the aftermath of that fire that Violet had first had occasion to speak at length with Ralph Rhodes. She had known him by sight for several years, of course. In a town the size of Redemption, everyone knew everyone else by sight. Ralph Rhodes ran the largest cattle ranch in the county, the Double R, about 8 miles north of town, and he came to Redemption once a week for supplies, and occasionally for a drink at the Desert Rose, and every Sunday to the non-denominational church, where he sat in the second pew with his daughter Clara beside him, both of them very correct and very still, like people who have learned that stillness is a form of protection. He was a widower. His wife, Sarah Rhodes, had died 3 years earlier in childbirth, along with the infant, a boy who had never drawn breath. Clara had been 9 years old, and Ralph had been 36, and he had subsequently become the kind of man that women in Redemption described as tragic and men described as capable, and both descriptions were equally accurate. He was 39 now, and Violet was 26, and the 13-year gap between them had never previously seemed significant because they had never previously had any reason to talk to each other in any sustained way. The reason presented itself 3 days after the fire, when Ralph Rhodes came to the Townsend house with a proposition. Violet opened the door herself because Dolores was in the kitchen and Edmund was resting, and she found him standing on the porch with his hat in his hand and a look of studied neutrality on his face that she would come to recognize as his equivalent of an elaborate emotional preparation. "Miss Townsend," he said, "I apologize for calling unannounced. I would like to speak with your father if he is receiving visitors." "My father is not well today," Violet said. "You may speak with me." He had looked at her, then really looked at her, perhaps for the first time, and something shifted in his expression. Not condescension. It was more like a recalibration. He had expected to deal with an old man and found himself facing a woman who was clearly in charge of her own household, and he was adjusting to that fact in real time. "Very well," he said. "May I come in?" She had sat him at the kitchen table and given him coffee, because that was what you did, and she had listened as he explained that he had heard about the Townsend freight operations difficulties, and that he had a proposition that might benefit both parties. The proposition was this: he needed to get a large number of cattle to the railroad yard in El Paso by late November. It was a long drive, over difficult terrain, and he usually handled it himself with his own hands. But this year he had a problem. His trail boss, a man named Vicent Garza, had broken his leg in a horse accident and would not be fit to travel for months. Ralph had lost 2 other experienced hands to a rival rancher who was paying higher wages, and he was short on the kind of men he trusted for a long drive. He needed someone to handle the logistics, the supply contracts, the route permissions, the arrangements at the railroad yard in El Paso. It was administrative work, correspondence work, the kind of work that required a sharp mind and reliable communication skills. He had heard that Miss Townsend did exactly that kind of work for her father's freight business. He was prepared to pay a fair rate, he said, and the payment would be substantial enough to help the Townsend operation get back on its feet. Violet had asked exactly 3 questions. What was the timeline? What were the specific deliverables, and what was he prepared to pay? He had answered all 3 without hesitation, and the number he named for payment was, in fact, quite fair. More than fair. She had said she would speak with her father and give him an answer within 2 days. She had spoken with her father that evening. Edmund had listened from his chair by the fire, and then he had been quiet for a long time, and then he had said, with a particular careful precision, "Ralph Rhodes is a good man. I have always believed that, but I want you to be careful, Violet. A good man is not always an easy man." She had thought about that for a long time afterward. She had sent word the next morning she would take the work. What followed was 6 weeks of intense, focused labor that Violet would later describe as the most intellectually satisfying period of her adult life, and also the most emotionally confusing. She spent several hours of most days either at the Double R Ranch or in correspondence with suppliers and officials in El Paso and Las Cruces, and she saw Ralph Rhodes with a frequency and intimacy that would have been socially unremarkable between business partners, and was socially somewhat charged between an unmarried man and an unmarried woman in a small frontier town. She discovered in those weeks that Ralph Rhodes was not what she had expected. She had expected efficiency, and she found it, yes. He was meticulous about his operation, knew every head of cattle by sight, and ran his ranch with a precision that impressed her. But she had also expected coldness, because that was the reputation, and instead she found something more complicated. He was reserved, certainly. He chose his words carefully and did not speak unless he had something specific to say. But when he did speak, he was direct and honest, and occasionally, without warning, quietly funny, and those moments of unexpected humor were startling in a way that she felt somewhere in the middle of her chest. She discovered other things too. She discovered that he ate dinner every evening with Clara, who was a thoughtful and serious child who read everything she could get her hands on and asked questions about absolutely everything, and was, Violet quickly concluded, exactly the kind of daughter a man like Ralph deserved. She discovered that he had a habit of reading by the fire after Clara went to bed, not novels but history, and the occasional scientific text, and that the library shelf in his study was one of the most impressive private collections she had seen outside of a city. She discovered that he was patient with his horses in a way that revealed something essential about his character, and that he never raised his voice, and that he was, in fact, genuinely and deeply lonely in a way that he would have rather died than admit. She was careful with all of this. She filed it away with the same precision she applied to the supply contracts and the route permissions, and she did not examine it too closely. The cattle drive went well. It left in late October with 20 of Ralph's hands, a trail boss borrowed from a neighbor, and enough supplies to last the journey. Violet did not go on the drive itself. That was not part of the arrangement, but she had done her work thoroughly enough that everything that needed to be in place in El Paso was in place, and when the drive arrived and the cattle were loaded at the railroad yard, the transaction went without a significant hitch. Ralph returned to Redemption in mid-November, and he came to the Townsend house the day after his return with the payment in cash and a very precise and proper expression of thanks. Violet accepted the money and the thanks with equal precision, and that, she had assumed, was the end of their professional relationship. She had been wrong about that. Clara started appearing at the Townsend house in December. Not every day, but often enough. She would knock on the door in the late afternoon when she was finished with her lessons at the schoolhouse, and dolers would let her in, and she would sit at the kitchen table and ask Violet questions. Questions about the books on the shelf in the parlor. Questions about Virginia, which she had read about in a history text and was curious about. Questions about freighting and business, and how you calculated a profit margin. She never explained why she had started coming, and Violet never asked, because she suspected that Clara was lonely too, in a different and more acute way than her father, and that the child had found her way to a house where someone would talk to her and listen to her in return. Ralph had not sent her, and Violet was fairly certain, did not initially know she was coming. He found out in January of 1882, when he came to collect Clara after a longer than usual visit, and Violet had invited him in for coffee while Clara finished the passage she was reading, and the three of them had sat together in the parlor for an hour and talked about nothing in particular. The weather, the condition of the road north, an editorial in the Las Cruces newspaper about the extension of the railroad, and it had been, Violet thought, one of the most comfortable hours she had spent in recent memory. After that, Ralph sometimes came himself without Clara, to return a book his daughter had borrowed or to ask Violet's opinion on a contract he was reviewing, and these visits had a particular quality that Violet recognized with some alarm as being the opposite of purely professional. She was careful. She was very careful. She had grown up watching her father love a woman and then lose her, and she had developed over the years a particular vigilance against allowing herself to want things she could not control the outcome of. She was practical. She was competent. She was useful. These were the things she allowed herself to be, and they were good things and sufficient things, and she told herself that firmly and often. But there was a night in late January when Ralph had stayed later than usual. They had been reviewing a contract dispute that needed resolution, and the paperwork had taken longer than anticipated, and the fire in the parlor had burned down to embers, and Edmund had long since gone to bed, and they had been sitting across from each other in the quiet and the warmth with the papers spread between them, and Ralph had looked up from a particular clause and found her already looking at him. And neither of them had looked away for a moment that lasted several seconds longer than it needed to. He had looked away first. He had said something about the clause. She had answered. They had finished the review and he had said good night with perfect composure, and she had sat in the cooling parlor after he left and held very still for a long time, as if stillness might be a protection against the particular thing she was feeling. In February, he stopped coming. Not dramatically, not all at once. But his visits became less frequent, and when he did come to collect Clara, he stayed on the porch and did not accept the invitation to come in, and his manner, while never impolite, had closed around something in a way that felt deliberate. Clara still came. Clara came every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon as regular as a clock, and she never mentioned her father's withdrawal, and Violet never asked about it, but the child watched Violet with large, careful eyes that understood far more than a 12-year-old should have been required to understand. Violet was not wounded, she told herself. She was practical. She was competent. She was useful. She had not allowed herself to want anything, and therefore she had not lost anything. She told herself this with less conviction than she would have preferred. Spring came. The scrubland around Redemption turned briefly and brilliantly green with the late rains, and the creeks ran, and the air smelled of sage and wet earth, and Violet planted her kitchen garden and kept the ledgers and wrote the correspondence and read to her father in the evenings when his eyesight was giving him trouble, and she was fine. She was completely fine. And then, in late April, Clara came on a Wednesday afternoon, not her usual Tuesday or Thursday, and she was different. She was agitated in the careful way that children are agitated when they are trying very hard not to show it, and she sat at the kitchen table and picked at the edge of her sleeve and did not ask any questions about anything, and finally Violet said, "What is it, Clara?" Clara looked at her with those large, careful eyes. "My father," she said, "has been trying to write a letter." Violet waited. "For 2 months," Clara continued. "He sits at his desk after he thinks I am asleep, and I can see the light under the door, and in the morning there is always ash in the fireplace. He writes it and then he burns it. Every time." "Who is the letter to?" Violet asked, though she had already a feeling like cold water in her chest. Clara looked at her steadily. "You know who it is to," she said. Violet was quiet for a moment. The kitchen was warm. Outside, the new leaves on the cottonwood tree were bright and young. Somewhere down the street, a horse was moving at a slow, patient walk. "What does he want to say?" Violet asked very quietly. Clara reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out a piece of folded paper. "I found one before he burned it," she said. "He does not know I have it. I would like you to read it." Violet unfolded the paper. The handwriting was Ralph's, she knew it from the contracts, but looser than his usual careful hand, slightly uneven, as if the pen had been moving faster than the discipline that usually governed it. The letter said, in its incomplete, burned at the edges draft, "Miss Townsend, Violet, I am writing to say what I should have said in January and did not. I am not a man who finds it easy to speak about certain things. My daughter tells me, more directly than is perhaps appropriate for a child of her age, that there is something I should. The truth is that I have found in your company, and there it stopped." He had burned the rest, but the beginning was enough. The beginning was quite enough. Violet had sat for a long time looking at the singed paper. Clara had sat across from her, very still, waiting. "He will not send it," Clara said finally. "He keeps trying to write it correctly and he cannot, and then he burns it. He is too proud to send something that is not perfect. He thinks if it is not exactly right it is better to say nothing." "He is right that it has to be right," Violet said carefully. "He is wrong that silence is better," Clara said, with a 12-year-old's absolute certainty. Another silence. Violet folded the partial letter very carefully and held it. "What are you asking me to do, Clara?" she said. "I am asking you to write the letter," Clara said. "The real one, the one he cannot write. And I am asking you to help post it so that it is sent before he can burn this attempt too." Violet looked at the child across the table. Clara's expression was earnest and a little desperate and also very, very certain, the certainty of someone who loves a person and sees them clearly and is willing to do the difficult thing because the alternative is worse. "That is a significant thing to ask," Violet said. "I know it," Clara said. "Your father will be angry." "Yes," Clara agreed. "He will, and then he will be glad." Violet was quiet for a long moment, and then she said, "Leave it with me until tomorrow." She spent the rest of that day and most of the next morning wrestling with herself. She wrote drafts of her own, not on paper, but in her head, testing phrases and discarding them, and she argued both sides of the question with the same precision she applied to contract disputes, and she arrived eventually at the conclusion that Clara was right. Not because the end justified the means, but because Ralph Rhodes was a man who had been locked inside his own pride for so long that he had forgotten there was a door, and someone needed to tell him where it was. She wrote the letter that afternoon. She wrote it in Ralph's voice, or the voice she had come to know from all those evenings of conversation and contract review, direct, honest, without ornament. She did not write what she imagined he felt. She wrote what he had already written in that burned fragment, and simply found the words he had been unable to reach. The letter said, "Dear Miss Townsend, I am writing to say plainly what I have been unable to say by any other means. I have valued your company and your intelligence and your honesty since the autumn of last year, and I find that I have come to value them in a way that exceeds the professional and borders on the personal. I am aware that I have not given you adequate reason to expect this letter, having been less present in recent months than I would have wished. That absence was not indifference, it was its opposite. I do not ask for anything in return that you are not willing to give freely. I ask only that you know how I regard you. Respectfully and with sincerity, Ralph Rhodes." She had read it over 3 times. Then she had folded it, addressed the envelope, and given it to Clara the following morning. And now Ralph knew. He was standing outside the post office in the afternoon light, hat on his head, face closed against the world, and the letter was already on its way, and there was nothing to be done about it. Violet stepped out of the post office and found him there. He had not left. She had expected him to leave and he had not, and she was not sure what to make of that. He was leaning against the wall of the building with his arms crossed and his eyes on the distant red hills, and he did not look at her when she came out, but he did not walk away either. She stood a few feet from him and waited. The silence stretched out long enough to be its own kind of conversation. "How much of it is what I actually feel?" he said at last. It was not a hostile question. It was something closer to wondering. "All of it," Violet said. "I only said what you had already tried to say. I just found the words." He was quiet again. A wagon went past on the main street, raising a little dust. "That is a strange thing," he said finally, "to have someone else find your words for you." "Yes," she agreed. "It is." He looked at her then, full on the way he had in the parlor in January, and this time neither of them looked away. "I am still angry," he said. "I know you are. I was not finished deciding. I know that too. You made the decision for me." "Your daughter made the decision," Violet said. "I only wrote it down." Something moved across his face. That particular complicated thing again, anger and something else running underneath it like a river under ice. "Clara," he said, with a tone that contained about 17 different things at once. "She loves you very much," Violet said. "She has been watching you be miserable for 2 months and she decided to do something about it. She is 12 years old. Yes. And she is smarter than both of us." He exhaled. It was not quite a laugh, but it was in the same territory. He looked away from her and back at the hills and then back at her, and then he said, with what seemed like a very significant effort, "Would you like to go for a ride on Sunday afternoon? I could show you the north pasture. Clara has been asking me to invite you for months, and I have been finding reasons not to, and I am," he paused, "out of reasons." Violet felt something in her chest loosen and settle simultaneously, like a knot that has been held too tight for too long finally being allowed to release. "I would like that very much," she said. He nodded once, very correctly, put 2 fingers to the brim of his hat and walked away down the street, and Violet stood in the afternoon light watching him go, and the warmth in her chest was something she decided, for the first time in a very long time, she would allow herself to feel. The ride on Sunday was the first of many. There is a particular kind of courtship that happens in wide open country, under enormous skies, where the distances give you permission to say things you might not say in a room. The north pasture of the Double R stretched out in the late afternoon light like something painted yellow grass and red rock, and the faint silver thread of a creek in the distance. And the sky above all of it was the particular deep blue of New Mexico at 4 in the afternoon, with a few white clouds moving west toward Arizona. Ralph rode beside her on a big gray horse named Lincoln, and she was on her own mare, a bay she called Penny that she had raised from a foal, and they rode at a gentle pace and talked about the pasture and the cattle and the winter that was finally giving way to spring. And gradually, almost without noticing the transition, they talked about other things. He told her about growing up in Missouri, in a town not unlike Redemption, the son of a farmer who worked hard and expected the same from everyone around him. He told her about coming west in 1866 at the age of 23, with money he had saved working on his father's farm and a determination to make something he could call his own. He told her about the first years at the Double R, which had been harder than he had allowed himself to imagine. They would be drought and disease, and cattle losses that had, on more than one occasion, come close to ending everything. He told her about Sarah. Not easily and not in great detail, but he told her. He said she had been kind and brave, and that she had loved this country even though she had been raised in Virginia, like Violet's mother, and that she had been better at most things than he was, more patient, more social, more willing to ask for help, and that her absence was a fact he had organized his entire life around without ever quite deciding to. Violet listened to all of this with the same attention she brought to everything, and she told him things in return. About her mother, and the fever, and the particular silences that had lived in the Townsend house after Catherine died. About the books she had read by firelight when she was a girl, escaping into stories about places she had never been. About the freight business and the satisfaction she found in making complicated things work, and the fear she had felt watching her father fold inward after the fire. "How is Edmund?" Ralph asked. "Older," she said simply, "but steadier than he was in the autumn. I think he frightened himself a little how much he withdrew. He has been making an effort since Christmas." Ralph nodded. "He is a good man," he said. "Your father." "He said the same of you," Violet said. Something warmed in Ralph's expression. Not much. He was not a man who wore warmth on the outside very readily, but enough to be visible. They rode back to the ranch house in the long evening light, and Clara was waiting on the porch with a look of studiously innocent inquiry that fooled absolutely no one. And Violet stayed for supper, which dolers would not have approved of, but which felt entirely natural. And the three of them ate a meal of beans and cornbread and dried beef in the kitchen of the ranch house. And Ralph and Violet argued pleasantly about the merits of a particular route modification for the autumn cattle drive. And Clara asked approximately 40 questions about Virginia and the Civil War and the railroad. And it was, Violet thought, the most purely comfortable evening she had spent in years. He walked her out to her horse when the supper was done and the dishes were cleared, and they stood in the yard in the dark with the stars enormous overhead, and he said, without looking at her, "I would like to do this again." "Yes," she said. "Next Sunday," he said. "Yes," she said again. He held her horse's bridle while she mounted, and then he looked up at her in the dark with that direct gaze, and she felt again that sensation of something loosening in her chest. And then she rode home through the night with the stars above and the warm desert air and a feeling that might, if she was not very careful, become something quite important. She was not very careful. May and June passed in a series of Sundays and occasional weekday evenings, and each occasion added something new, a piece of information, a moment of connection, a conversation that went somewhere neither of them had expected. Ralph was not an easy man to know. He was guarded in the way that loss teaches guardedness, and he had spent 3 years using silence as a wall, and dismantling walls is slow work. But he was consistent. He showed up when he said he would. He said what he meant. He listened with a quality of attention that made Violet feel that she was being genuinely heard, which was not a thing she had often experienced. Clara was a constant and rather charming presence in all of this. She made no secret of her agenda. She contrived, with the transparent but irresistible maneuvering of a very bright 12-year-old, to leave Violet and her father alone together at every possible opportunity, and she reported the results of her observations to Violet with a candor that was both flattering and mortifying. He smiled 3 times at dinner, she reported one Tuesday afternoon at the Townsend kitchen table, with the gravity of someone presenting scientific data. He usually only smiles once. Clara, Violet said carefully. He also stayed up until 10 o'clock reading that book you lent him instead of going to bed at 9, Clara continued. He thought I did not notice. You are very observant, Violet said. He is happy when you are there, Clara said simply and directly, in the way that children sometimes say things that cut straight to the truth and do not apologize for it. He has not been happy in a long time. I would like him to be happy. Violet looked at the child across the table and felt something in her chest that was a very specific combination of fondness and grief and hope all mixed together. I would like that too, she said. In early July, on a Sunday afternoon when the heat was pressing down on the land with its full summer weight, and even the cicadas seemed to be making a concerted effort to survive it, Ralph and Violet were sitting in the shade of the large cottonwood tree beside the Double R Ranch house, having given up on any ambition more strenuous than remaining still, and Ralph said something that changed the tenor of everything. He said, I want to tell you about the letter. She was quiet, waiting. What I was trying to write, he said. He was looking at the cottonwood leaves rather than at her, which she had learned was his way of saying something that required looking away from. I wrote it 9 times, possibly 10, I cannot now remember exactly. Every time I thought I had it and I read it back and it was wrong. Not factually wrong, just not what I actually meant, not the real thing. What is the real thing? She asked softly. He was quiet for a moment. A hot wind moved through the cottonwood leaves above them. I am afraid of this, he said. That is the real thing. I am afraid of it in a way that I find very difficult to admit, because I have generally managed my life by not being afraid of things, or by not admitting it when I am. And this, he paused, and there was something in that pause that she felt in her whole body. This is the kind of thing that a man can lose very badly if it goes wrong. And losing badly is something I have experience with and would prefer not to repeat. Violet was quiet for a moment, looking at her own hands in her lap. I am afraid too, she said. I have been afraid of it since January, which is why I did not say anything either, which is presumably why we both needed a 12-year-old to intervene. A real, genuine laugh from him, then short and surprised, as if it had escaped before he could stop it. He looked at her and she looked at him, and they were both smiling in the shade of the cottonwood tree with the summer heat bearing down and the fear still there between them but named now and therefore smaller. Are we going to let it stop us? She asked. He considered this with his habitual care. No, he said. I do not believe we are. After that, things moved with a clarity and direction that the previous months had lacked. There was no more ambiguity about what was happening between them. They were, in the language of the time and place, courting, which meant that Ralph came to the Townsend house on Tuesday and Thursday evenings as well as Sundays, and that Edmund Townsend was aware of it, and approved of it with a quiet pride that expressed itself as an extra measure of alertness. Whenever Ralph was present, as if the old man was reassuring himself, visit by visit, that his initial assessment had been correct. Edmund had a conversation with Ralph in late July, just the two of them in the parlor, while Violet very deliberately stayed in the kitchen with dolers and pretended to be interested in the question of whether the cornbread needed more salt. She did not know what was said. She never asked and neither of them told her. But afterward, Edmund was more cheerful than he had been in months, and Ralph came to find her in the kitchen with a faint color along his cheekbones that she found extremely endearing. August came, blazing and relentless, and Ralph invited Violet to see the Double R's summer operation, the branding and sorting that happened in August before the autumn drive, and she went 3 days in a row and proved useful enough that 2 of Ralph's hands, a taciturn man named Bautista and a younger man named Owen Carey, who was perhaps 19 and enthusiastic about everything, began consulting her on logistics questions with an ease that suggested they had quickly understood what she was to their employer. Owen Carey, in particular, was cheerfully transparent about his approval of the whole situation. "Ma'am," he said to her on the second day, with a grin that took up about 60% of his face, "I have worked for Mr. Rhodes for 2 years, and I have never once seen him voluntarily explain a thing to anyone, and he just explained the entire sorting system to you for 20 minutes. That is," he said with evident satisfaction, "a good sign." "Owen," Ralph said from 10 feet away, without looking up from the calf he was examining. "Yes, sir," Owen said, and went back to work with his grin entirely intact. On the last evening of August, when the day's work was done and the hands had gone to the bunkhouse and Clara was asleep and the ranch house was quiet, Ralph and Violet sat on the front porch in 2 chairs with the cooling night air coming down from the mountains, and he asked her to marry him. He did it plainly and directly, without ornamentation, in the way he did most things. He said he had thought carefully about whether he was asking for the right reasons, and he was satisfied that he was. He said he was aware that he was not the easiest kind of man to live with, not because he was unkind, but because he was private and sometimes stubborn and constitutionally unable to ask for help, a fact to which recent events had provided testimony. He said he believed that she understood him in a way that he found both surprising and essential, and that he would like, if she was willing, to spend the considerable remainder of his life understanding her in return. He said that Clara loved her, which they both already knew, but which he said anyway because it was true and it mattered. He said that he loved her. He said it without drama, in the same voice he had used to describe the cattle operation and the North Pasture and his childhood in Missouri. And it was perhaps that very lack of drama that made it feel so entirely real, like a fact that had been true for some time and had simply been waiting to be stated. Violet had sat for a moment in the dark with the mountains all around and the stars overhead and the cooling air on her face, and she had felt the fear. She would have been lying to say she did not, and then she had set the fear aside with the firm, practical decisiveness that was one of her deepest characteristics, and she had said, "Yes, I would like that very much." He had taken her hand. He was not in general a man who expressed things through touch, and that made the gesture more significant rather than less. He held her hand in both of his for a moment, and she felt the warmth of it, and then he said quietly, "Good." They announced the engagement the following Sunday, and the reaction in Redemption was everything that a small frontier town's reaction to such news typically was: immediate, comprehensive, and enthusiastically opinionated. The women of the non-denominational church, led by a formidable figure named Mrs. Agatha Pruitt, who had organized every significant social event in Redemption for the past 10 years, descended on Violet with a combination of congratulations and logistical inquiry that made Violet feel she was managing a cattle drive of a different kind entirely. Edmund Townsend shook Ralph's hand and then pulled him into a brief, fierce embrace that clearly surprised both men, and then stepped back and composed himself and said, "She is everything, Rhodes. You know that." "Yes, sir," Ralph said. "I know." Clara's reaction was the simplest and the most complete. She said nothing at all. She came to stand beside Violet and put her arms around her waist and held on, and Violet held her back, and they stood like that for a moment while the September sun came through the parlor window and turned everything gold. The wedding was set for November, which gave enough time to prepare without waiting so long that either of them might find a new reason to hesitate, a timeline that Violet had, in fact, quietly suggested, and that Ralph had immediately agreed to, which she thought showed considerable personal growth on his part. The intervening months were full in the best possible way. There were practical arrangements to make the Townsend house would remain Edmund's home with Dolars to look after him, and Violet would move to the Double R, and Edmund would come for Sunday dinners and holidays, and Ralph had already begun renovating the spare room adjacent to the main bedroom as a proper reading room, because he had observed that Violet could not function without access to books, and he had elected to accommodate this rather than argue about it, which was also considerable personal growth. There were also less practical arrangements, which turned out to be equally important. Violet and Ralph developed in those months the particular vocabulary of a couple, the shorthand, the private references, the way a person learns to read another person's silences and moods. She learned that he was at his most honest in the evenings, when the day's work was done and the guard was down. He learned that she thought best when she was moving, and that if she seemed to be pacing, she was actually working through something important and should not be interrupted. She learned that he had a specific kind of laugh, infrequent, and therefore precious, that he reserved for things that genuinely surprised him. He learned that she could be angry with a quiet precision that was more effective than shouting and considerably more alarming. They argued, on one memorable occasion in October, about the route for the autumn cattle drive, a genuine, sustained disagreement about logistics that lasted 2 evenings and involved considerable mutual stubbornness before arriving at a compromise that was, both of them admitted afterward, better than either of their original positions. Violet found this argument clarifying in an unexpected way. They had disagreed as equals, spoken directly, neither capitulated out of politeness, and arrived somewhere better than either had started. It was, she thought, a very good sign about the practical reality of what they were choosing. October passed in golden light and long evenings, and the particular sweetness that comes from having made a decision and being at peace with it. Ralph read beside her in the evenings, their chairs angled toward the same fire, and Clara read across from them, and the ranch house was filled with a quiet that was genuinely content, not the silence of grief or suppression, but the silence of people who do not need to fill every moment with words because the presence itself is sufficient. Edmund came to dinner on Sundays as arranged, and his health seemed to improve with the regularity of it. Or perhaps it improved because he could see that Violet was happy, and that knowledge took a weight off him he had been carrying for a long time. The wedding day arrived on a Saturday in mid-November, under a sky that was the clear, cold blue of high autumn in New Mexico, with the mountains sharp and snow-touched in the distance, and the cottonwood trees holding their last gold leaves against the wind. The non-denominational church was full. Redemption turned out for a wedding the way it turned out for everything significant, with a thoroughness that would have been overwhelming if Violet had been the kind of woman who was easily overwhelmed. She was not. She stood in the church doorway in a dress she had made herself from fabric ordered from El Paso, cream-colored wool, not elaborate, but beautifully fitted, and she looked down the aisle to where Ralph stood waiting with the minister and Owen Carey, who was serving as witness with the same comprehensive grin he had been wearing since August, and she felt, for the first time in a very long time, entirely without fear. Edmund walked her down the aisle. He was slower than he had once been, and he leaned on his cane more heavily than he would have preferred, but he was upright and present, and when he placed her hand in Ralph's, he was smiling in a way that made something in her chest complete. Ralph was looking at her as if she were the only thing in the room, which she was. For him, she knew that now with a certainty that went beyond reasoning. He was steady and still and utterly present, and he said his vows in that measured, direct voice, and she said hers, and when the minister pronounced them, married, Ralph held both her hands and looked at her with everything he had been unable to write in 9 burning letters right there in his face, fully visible, and she did not look away from it. Clara stood in the front pew with dolors and cried with a happy completeness that impressed everyone present. Life at the Double R in those first months of their marriage was not without its adjustments. No marriage ever is, and a marriage between two people who are both accustomed to running their own affairs and making their own decisions requires some architectural rearrangement, not of feeling, but of habit and territory and the particular negotiations of daily life. There were moments of friction, small and manageable, and there were moments of revelation, unexpected and precious, and there were long evenings by the fire that were simple and good in a way that needed no further description. Violet took over the Double R's administrative operations with Ralph's full and relieved consent. He was exceptional with the cattle and the land and the practical management of the ranch, and he was adequate with the paperwork, and he knew the difference. She brought to it the same systematic precision she had brought to her father's freight business, and within 3 months the Double R's accounts were more organized than they had been in years, a fact that 2 different suppliers in El Paso commented on with some surprise. She also, in January of 1883, discovered that she was expecting their first child. She told Ralph on a Sunday morning, before Edmund came for dinner, sitting at the kitchen table over coffee, in the practical and direct way she did most things, and watched the sequence of responses move across his face in quick succession: surprise, and then a particular quality of stillness, and then something that was very specifically joy, rare and unguarded, breaking through his habitual composure like light through a cloud. He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and held her, which was not something he did impulsively, and she leaned into him, and the kitchen smelled of coffee and wood smoke, and outside the winter light was pale and clear, and she thought, with a feeling like coming to rest at the end of a very long journey, that this was exactly what she had not known she was waiting for. Edmund, when told at dinner, went very quiet and then said, "Your mother would have been so glad," which was the most he had said about Catherine in years, and the room held that for a moment with care. Clara received the news with a 3-minute burst of unbridled enthusiasm that involved considerably more volume than she typically produced, followed by a very serious 5-minute discussion of the baby's probable educational needs, which she had apparently already begun considering. "I will teach it to read," she announced. "He or she will be an infant," Violet pointed out. "I will start early," Clara said firmly. "I have read that early exposure to language is very important." "Where did you read that?" Ralph asked. "In one of Miss Via," she stopped. "In one of Violet's books," she corrected herself, with a small, conscious adjustment that Violet noticed and felt warmly. Clara had been working in small, careful increments toward calling her Violet rather than Miss Townsend, and each time she managed it, Violet felt it as a gift. The spring of 1883 passed gently. The ranch work continued, and Violet continued to manage the administrative operations, adapting as her pregnancy advanced, and Ralph was attentive in the understated way that was his style, not hovering, not anxious, but present in an additional way, with a watchfulness that she found reassuring rather than confining. They had a conversation in March that she would think about for a long time afterward. They were riding the north pasture. She was still riding more carefully now on Penny, who was steady and reliable, and they had come to the creek, which was running with spring water, and they stopped and dismounted and stood watching the water for a while, and Ralph said, "I never thought I would do this again." She looked at him. "Have a child," he said. "Start again. I had decided after Sarah that I would simply continue, do the work, raise Clara. That was enough. That was a good life, a sufficient life." He paused. "I was wrong about sufficient." "You were not wrong that it was good," she said. "No," he agreed. "But I was wrong that it was enough. It was not enough. I had simply stopped believing there was more." He looked at her then fully in that way he had. "You were the more," he said. "You and this." He gestured slightly at the life around them, the land, the water, the future implicit in the spring. She was quiet for a moment, feeling the weight and the gift of what he had said. "You almost did not send the letter," she said. "I almost did not," he confirmed. "You would have kept burning it." "Probably forever," he said, with a rueful honesty that was relatively new for him and entirely welcome. If Clara had not intervened," Violet finished, "we would both currently be considerably less happy." "Yes," he said. "I owe my 12-year-old daughter a significant debt." "She is 13 now," Violet said. "I owe my 13-year-old daughter a significant debt," he amended, and there was the rare laugh again, brief and surprised and genuine, and she loved him so specifically in that moment, not as an abstract feeling but as a fact, detailed and particular, the way you love a real thing that you know completely. The baby came in late August of 1883, on a night when the heat had finally broken, and a storm was moving in from the southwest, bringing with it a cool wind and the smell of distant rain. The labor was longer than Violet would have chosen, and Dr. Samuel Aldrich, Redemption's physician, a calm and competent man who had delivered half the children in the county, attended it from beginning to end. Ralph spent the night in the kitchen, alternating between the table and the window, and Owen Carey, who had been working late in the barn when the labor began and had subsequently found reasons to remain in the vicinity, kept him company with a combination of terrible coffee and optimistic conversation that Ralph would later say had been either very helpful or genuinely maddening. He could not determine which. Clara spent the night in the parlor with a book she did not actually read, fully awake, waiting. Just before dawn, when the storm had arrived and rain was falling on the desert in the particular relieved way that rain falls on country that has not seen it in a long time, Dr. Aldrich came to the kitchen door and said, "Mr. Rhodes, you have a son. Both are well." Ralph stood up from the table with the specific stillness of a man receiving news too large to process immediately, and then he crossed to the kitchen door and went down the hall without a word. He named the boy James Edmund, James for his own father and Edmund for Violet's, and when Edmund Townsend came the next morning and was told the name, the old man sat in the chair beside the bed and held the baby and said nothing at all for a long time, and his eyes were bright. James Edmund Rhodes came into the world with considerable appetite for both food and noise, and he adapted the rhythm of the double R to include himself with a thoroughness that impressed everyone. He was, from the beginning, alert and sturdy and opinionated, and he demonstrated early an interest in everything that moved, horses particularly, and the dogs that kept the cattle, and the birds that came to the water trough and his father's hands, which he would grip with both of his, and study with a concentration that suggested he was committing them to memory. Clara took her role as older sister with a gravity that was both touching and slightly hilarious. She had, as promised, begun reading to him at an extremely early age. She read to him about history and geography and the natural world, from books she selected with great deliberation, and she reported to Violet on his responses with the same systematic approach she applied to everything. "He responded very positively to the section about rivers," she said one afternoon. "He is 4 months old," Violet pointed out. "He tracked the pages," Clara said firmly. Ralph, when presented with these reports, had the grace to receive them with a straight face, though Violet had observed him, on more than one occasion, turning away from Clara with a smile he was not quite able to suppress. Edmund Townsend continued to come on Sundays and increasingly to stay for Monday as well, and then Tuesday, until by the spring of 1884 the arrangement was essentially that he lived at the Double R and occasionally stayed at the Townsend house in town when dolers needed company, which worked for everyone involved. His health had stabilized and was, Violet thought, improved. The family around him, the baby, the regular meals and the warmth of a full house had done something restorative for an old man who had been quietly diminishing in a quieter house. The freight business had recovered as well, or enough of it had. Violet had spent the better part of 1882 restructuring the operation, finding new contracts, and reducing its dependence on any single client, and by 1883 it was running reliably, managed by a capable younger man named Archero Salinas, who had come to Redemption from Las Cruces and had proved both honest and industrious. The income went to Edmund, who had what he needed, and Violet kept enough oversight that she remained confident in the operations, which satisfied both her practical instincts and her sense of loyalty to what her father had built. Life in the latter part of 1884 settled into a rhythm that was full and various and good. The autumn cattle drive was the most successful the Double R had run since Ralph took over the ranch. The organization was excellent. The prices at the El Paso Railroad Yard were favorable, and they returned to Redemption in late November with enough profit to make substantial improvements to the ranch, including a proper new barn that Ralph had been planning for 2 years and had finally budgeted for. The new barn became something of a community event in its construction. Several of the neighboring ranchers and their hands participated in the raising, as was the custom, and the day of the barn raising became an occasion that involved considerable food, brought out most of Redemption, and concluded with a level of sociability that Ralph submitted to with the particular stoic tolerance of a man who has accepted that his wife is naturally warm, and people tend to follow her warmth, and this means his front yard is periodically full of neighbors. Owen Carey, now 21 and a fixture of the Double R, had developed into a genuinely skilled ranch hand, and had also, Violet had observed, developed a shy but persistent admiration for the eldest daughter of the Becker family at the general store, a young woman of 20 named Miriam who was brisk and clever, and clearly amused by Owen's elaborate casualness whenever she appeared. Violet had refrained from involving herself in this, with considerable discipline, though she had mentioned to Ralph that she thought Owen deserved a kind word of encouragement, and Ralph had said, with complete neutrality, that it was none of their business, and Violet had agreed, and then they had both watched Owen and Miriam talk by the fence for 40 minutes at the barn raising with the restrained satisfaction of people who are absolutely not interfering. Clara, at 14, was the most intellectually hungry person in Redemption, and this had become a practical challenge. The schoolhouse had done well enough for her earlier years, but she had long since exceeded what it could offer, and the question of what came next was one that all three of them, Violet, Ralph, and Clara herself, had been working around without quite addressing. It was Violet who finally addressed it. She raised it at Sunday dinner in January of 1885, calmly and directly, presenting the situation as a logistical problem that required a solution. She had done some correspondence, she said. There was a school in Santa Fe, the Loreto Academy, that had an excellent academic program. Clara was of the age and clearly of the ability. The arrangement would require Clara to board in Santa Fe during the school year, which was not insignificant, but the alternative was allowing a highly capable mind to go unused or underdeveloped for lack of adequate challenge, which was also not insignificant. Ralph had been quiet throughout this presentation, with a quality of quiet that Violet had learned to read as meaning he was feeling something considerable, and not yet sure how to organize it. Clara, for her part, had sat very still with her eyes very bright. "It would be your decision," Violet said to Clara. "Both of you," she added to Ralph. Ralph looked at his daughter. Clara looked at her father. Something passed between them, one of those wordless communications that exist between parents and children who know each other very well, a whole conversation conducted in a second. "I want to go," Clara said, quietly but with complete certainty. Ralph nodded once. His jaw was tight in the way it got when he was managing something he had not expected to feel so strongly. "Then we will arrange it," he said. Clara had crossed to him then and hugged him, which was something she did less often at 14 than she had at 12, and he held her with both arms, and Violet looked at her plate and gave them the privacy of the moment. Later that night, after Clara was asleep, Ralph and Violet sat by the fire and he said, "She is ready, I am not, but she is." "You will be," Violet said, "by September." He looked at her sidelong, "That confident." "I know you," she said simply. He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said, "I suppose you do." Spring came again, the third spring of their marriage, and with it a second pregnancy, which Violet discovered in April of 1885, and told Ralph over breakfast with the same direct calm she had used the first time, and which produced the same sequence of responses: surprise, stillness, and then that unguarded joy that she loved most in him because it was most fully himself. James was almost 2, and thoroughly in command of his own legs and opinions, and he had recently developed a habit of following Ralph around the ranch with a single-minded determination that resulted in Ralph periodically appearing in the kitchen doorway with a small, very serious person attached to his leg, both of them looking as if this was simply the expected state of affairs. "He tried to lift the saddle," Ralph reported one morning. "He is 22 months old," Violet said. "He is very determined," Ralph said. "He is your son," Violet said. Ralph looked at James, who was currently examining the texture of the doorframe with deep concentration, and said, "He is," with a tone that contained, in its 3 syllables, a whole universe of quiet pride. Clara left for Santa Fe in September of 1885. The morning she left, the family gathered in the ranch yard: Violet, Ralph, James, Edmund, who had come for the occasion, Dolores, Owen, and Bautista, and Clara stood with her trunk and her books and her serious eyes, and she embraced Edmund and Dolores and Owen and Bautista, and she held James for a long moment and told him to be good and to listen to his parents and to eat his vegetables. And James, who understood perhaps a third of this, patted her face with one small hand. She embraced Violet last. She held on for a moment and Violet held her back, and Violet said quietly against Clara's hair, "You did a remarkable thing, you know." Clara pulled back a little and looked at her. "The letter," Violet said. "You did that and everything that came from it. You knew what your father needed before he did, and you were brave enough to act. That is not a small thing." Clara was quiet for a moment, her eyes serious and bright. "I just wanted him to be happy," she said. "He is," Violet said. "You made that possible." Clara nodded, absorbing this, and then turned to her father. Ralph was standing a few feet away with his hat in his hand, and his face in that particular careful arrangement he used when feeling a great deal and preferring not to show it, which worked somewhat less well than he believed it did. He took her in. She was taller than she had been. She was going toward something she had chosen and was ready for, and it was entirely right, and it was still very hard. "You will write," he said. "Every week," she said. He nodded. He placed his hands on her shoulders for a moment and looked at her, really looked at her, the way he did when he wanted to commit something to memory, and then he said simply, "I am proud of you." Clara, 14 years old and not generally given to dramatics, burst into tears. She embraced him fiercely, and he held her, and the morning light was clear and bright. And Violet put her arm around Edmund and watched and thought about letters and pride and the things we cannot say until someone gives us permission, and felt the new life in her, steady and certain and growing, and was wholly and completely grateful. The coach to Santa Fe took Clara away at 9 in the morning, and Ralph stood watching it until it was out of sight, and then he stood a moment longer, and then he turned back to the work of the day with the quiet resilience that was his deepest characteristic. That evening, after James was in bed, Ralph sat at his desk and wrote Clara a letter. He did not burn it. Violet knew because she could hear the scratch of the pen from the parlor where she was reading, and it did not stop. And in the morning the letter was sealed and addressed and ready to post, and there was no ash in the fireplace. She did not say anything about it. She posted it when she went to town, and she handed it to old Hector Price, and Hector, who was aware of the full history, in the way that postmasters in small towns are aware of everything, looked at her with his ancient eyes and said, with a small private satisfaction, "That man has come a long way." "Yes," Violet said, "he has." The second child came in December of 1885. A girl this time, born during a snow that came down soft and steady through the night and left the ranch and the land around it white and still and luminous in the morning. Dr. Aldrich attended again, and Ralph sat in the kitchen again. And this time James, who was 2 1/4 and felt strongly that he should be permitted to be wherever the action was, had to be physically prevented from investigating the hall by Owen Carey, who distracted him with a complex series of arrangements involving 2 tin cups and a length of rope that kept him occupied for the better part of an hour. They named her Sarah Catherine, Sarah for Ralph's first wife, whose memory deserved honoring, and Catherine for Violet's mother, and the combination of those two names was a piece of stitching together that felt exactly right. Sarah was, from the start, emphatically her own person. Where James was steady and deliberate, Sarah was quick and expressive, with a range of emotional response that she communicated at considerable volume and with great commitment. Where James studied things in silence, Sarah announced her opinions about everything immediately and expected them to be taken seriously. "She is extraordinary," Ralph said at approximately 2 in the morning during the second week, sitting beside the cradle with the expression of a man who has been thoroughly surprised by a very small person. "She is exactly like you in at least 3 respects," Violet said from the bed. He looked at her. "That is not possible," he said. "The stubbornness," Violet said. "The directness. The look she gives you when you do something she disapproves of." He looked at the baby. The baby, apparently awake and aware, looked back at him with an expression of considerable judgment. "Oh," he said. "Yes," she agreed and allowed herself to laugh. Clara came home for Christmas that year, taller still and full of Santa Fe, full of the school and the teachers and the other girls and the city and the books and all the new things she was learning. And she talked through dinner and through the evening and into the night. And Ralph listened to all of it with a fullness of attention that was clearly deeply satisfying to her. And Violet watched him listen and thought about all the letters that had burned in his fireplace, and all the things that might have remained unsaid, and felt the particular warmth that comes from knowing how close things might have gone differently. Clara held Sarah for the first time on Christmas morning, sitting by the fire with the baby in her arms and James leaning against her knee wanting to see, and she looked down at her sister with an expression of something very close to reverence. "She looks like you," she said to Violet. "People keep saying that," Violet said. "It is a compliment," Clara said very seriously. "I know," Violet said. "Thank you." Clara stayed through the new year and left again in early January of 1886, back to Santa Fe and the academy and the life she was building there. And Ralph posted her a letter the week after she left and every week thereafter without a single exception. And Clara wrote back with equal regularity. And these letters, Ralph's measured, honest, carefully chosen words, and Clara's detailed, enthusiastic reports were one of the structuring elements of the ranch house's weeks. A regular presence and connection across distance. Violet sometimes wrote to Clara separately, a different kind of letter, more conversational, the kind of letter you write to someone you have chosen as well as inherited. Clara wrote back to her in the same way, and these exchanges developed their own particular texture over time, wry, frank, warm, the correspondence of two women who understand each other very well. The years at the Double R acquired their own rhythm after that. The cattle drives in autumn and the branding in summer, and the accounting in winter and the planting in spring, and James growing from a determined toddler into a serious, steady boy who followed his father around the ranch with focused intent, and was clearly going to know everything about cattle by the time he was 10. And Sarah growing from a very emphatic infant into a very emphatic small person who had opinions about everything and communicated them at length, and was clearly going to know everything about everything by the time she was 8. Edmund Townsend lived until 1889, which was 4 years longer than Violet had dared to hope in the autumn of 1881, when he had seemed to be folding into himself like old paper. He died in February, at the ranch in his bed, with Violet holding his hand and Ralph and the children and Dolers and Archero Salinas, and several people from Redemption gathered in the house in the way people gather when an end is coming, and they want to bear witness. He said near the end to Violet, "Your mother would have been so glad of you, of all of this," and then after a pause, "I am glad too." She had held his hand and said, "I know, Papa." The grief of losing him was real and deep, and lasting in the way that the loss of a parent always is, a particular absence that reorganizes everything around it. But it was not the devastated grief of a life without love. Edmund had died surrounded by family, in a warm house, having seen his daughter settled and happy and her children growing, and the life she had built well and solid around her. He had died knowing that the things he had worked for and loved had continued and expanded and would go on after him, and that was the best ending a man could reasonably ask for. Ralph was steady through all of it, in the way he had learned to be steady, present, attentive, not pretending the grief away but not allowing it to sweep them under either. He managed the practical things with his characteristic competence and gave Violet space to feel what she needed to feel and was there when she needed him to be there. She had found him once, 2 weeks after Edmund's funeral, in the parlor in the early evening, standing before the shelf of books that had originally been hers, and were now arranged alongside his in the reading room she had made the Double R's parlor into. He was holding one of Edmund's books, a battered history of Virginia that had made the journey from the East in 1860. Just holding it, not reading it. She came to stand beside him. He put his arm around her. They stood there together in the quiet for a while, looking at the shelf of books, all those accumulated pages and lives and years. "He was proud of you," Ralph said. "He told me. The first time I asked his permission, he said, 'She has done everything herself and done it well.'" He said it like it was the thing he was most proud of in his life. Violet leaned into him. Outside, the winter evening was settling over the land, and inside the house was warm and lit, and James and Sarah were in the kitchen with dolers doing something with remarkable noise, and it was all still here, all of it still going. Clara came home for the summer of 1889 and decided in September that she would stay in Redemption rather than returning to Santa Fe. She was 19 and she had finished the academy's program, and she was, to Violet's considerable delight, planning to teach. The Redemption schoolhouse needed a teacher, the previous one, a Mr. Hargrove, had married a woman from Las Cruces and moved south, and Clara had applied for the position and received it, and she moved back to the Double R with the particular purposefulness of someone returning to the place they intend to remain. She was, by this time, a person of considerable confidence and clarity, educated, thoughtful, direct in the way that both her father and Violet were direct, but with her own particular warmth layered through it. She was, Ralph said on one quiet evening, as close to a combination of the best parts of both of them as was probably possible, which was not something he said easily, and which Violet therefore kept in her memory as carefully as she kept the partial letter, the singed edges and the incomplete sentences that had started everything. In the spring of 1890, the Double R had its best year. The cattle operation was running exceptionally well. The accounts were clean and organized. They had hired 2 new hands who were capable and reliable, and the ranch had expanded to include a small but productive kitchen garden that Sarah had appointed herself the manager of at age 4, with a dedication that had not diminished at age 5 or subsequently. Owen Carey had married Miriam Becker the previous autumn, in a ceremony at the non-denominational church that had involved considerable community participation, and an amount of emotion from Owen that delighted everyone present, and Miriam had come to work part-time at the Double R's administrative operations, giving Violet more time with the children, and with the reading she still required for her own equilibrium. Violet and Ralph's 5th wedding anniversary fell in November of 1890, and Ralph marked it by doing something so entirely unlike himself that Violet kept the evidence of it for the rest of her life. He wrote her a letter. He left it on her breakfast plate on the morning of the anniversary, sealed and addressed in his careful hand to Violet Rhodes, and she opened it at the kitchen table while the morning light came through the windows and the ranch began its day around her. The letter said, "Dear Violet, it has been 5 years since you agreed to this, and I have not found, in that time, adequate words to tell you what it has amounted to. I was not a man who knew how to ask for what he needed. I was not a man who knew how to receive what was offered. You have not required me to be either. You have simply been here, consistently and entirely yourself, and the life we have built has been what it is because you are what you are. I do not have the language for the whole of it. I have only this: thank you for writing the letter. Both of them, the one for me and the one to me, which has been every day of this. With everything I have, Ralph. She sat with the letter for a long time, with the kitchen warming around her and the sounds of the ranch beginning to stir and the children's voices somewhere in the house. Then she folded it and held it and let herself feel all of it. The 5 years and the letter that started it, and the 12-year-old who had known what her father needed. And all the Sundays and the cattle drives and the arguments and the evenings by the fire and the births and the losses and the ordinary days that made up the whole of it. Ralph came in from the morning's first check of the horses, dusty and carrying his hat, and found her at the table, and he read her face the way he had learned to read it over 5 years of looking carefully. He sat down across from her. "Too much?" he asked. "No," she said. "Exactly right." He nodded in that way of his brief and certain and complete. "I had help," he said. "What do you mean?" "I showed the draft to Clara," he said. "She told me the 3rd paragraph was wrong and helped me revise it." Violet looked at him. He had the faintest trace of a smile. "You asked Clara to help you write the letter," she said. "I did," he said. "You asked for help," she said. "I did," he said again. There was a moment of silence, and then Violet began to laugh, a real laugh, full and unguarded, the kind that comes from somewhere very happy. Ralph watched her with the undisguised pleasure. He allowed himself in private when she laughed, which was one of her favorite things about him. "She is going to be unbearably smug about this," Violet said, when the laughing settled. "She already is," he said. "She told me this morning before breakfast." Clara appeared in the kitchen doorway at that moment, with the particular expression of a 19-year-old who knows she has been exactly right about something important and is not going to pretend otherwise. Behind her, James and Sarah arrived in a rush of early morning energy, both of them talking simultaneously, and the kitchen filled with the ordinary noise of a full and living house. Ralph looked at Violet across the table, across the letter still in her hand, across 5 years and all they held. She looked back at him with everything she had, all the practicality and the directness and the care, and the love that had grown from that first impossible afternoon in the post office when she had refused to give him back the letter. "Happy anniversary," he said quietly. "Happy anniversary," she said. He reached across the table and took her hand, and she let him hold it, and around them the morning continued. The children, the noise, the light through the windows, the ranch waking up to another day, all of it going forward and alive, built from a letter that a proud man could not write and a daughter who loved him enough to find someone else who could. James climbed into his chair and demanded cornbread. Sarah announced that the kitchen garden needed water, and that someone other than herself was going to have to carry the bucket because she had already been out once and it was cold. Ralph poured himself coffee and began making the cornbread, because he had learned over 5 years that the kitchen ran better when he participated in it, and this was a thing he had decided without ever admitting to deciding. Violet watched all of it from her place at the table, the letter folded in her hand, and the morning light wide and clear, and the whole life around her solid and warm and real and entirely hers. And Clara, standing in the doorway with her arms crossed and her father's dark eyes and her own particular smile, looked at Violet and said, "I told you he would be glad." "You did," Violet said. "I am always right about these things," Clara said. "You are," Violet agreed. She tucked the letter into her pocket and got up to help with the cornbread, and the kitchen filled with the sound of morning and family and ordinary life, which is the best possible sound in the world when it belongs to you. And in the post office in Redemption, New Mexico Territory, old Hector Price sorted the morning's letters with the satisfaction of a man who has, in a small but real way, witnessed something important. Who knows that love sometimes arrives not in grand gestures but in envelopes, singed drafts and careful words, and the brave interventions of people who love those who cannot quite save themselves. The whole impossible, essential, ordinary miracle of it. Delivered here and posted there, and received at last.